right now. There we go.
Hello everyone, I'm Jane Green and I'm the founder and chair of SEDSConnective. We're neurodivergent symptomatic hypermobility charity, and that's quite a wide range, and we're really delighted today to have a really wide range of discussion on stretching with our superb specialist advisor, Bonnie Southgate. So I'm going to pass you over to her in a minute. Do remember we're all voluntary. If you would like to donate anything to our charity, that would be wonderful, so we can do more of these webinars and also get tech advisors to help. Thank you. Over to Bonnie.
Right. Thank you, Jane. And I really apologize to everybody. I just have absolutely no idea what happened there. I do Zoom meetings all the time and I don't know. Anyway, it's really lovely that some of you actually did make it into the meeting. And I'm really looking forward to doing more presentations for SEDS. In the future, any ideas or any questions that you have that relate to the musculoskeletal system, I would be happy to give a talk on. And it was a question by Jane that sort of made me think about the stretching idea. And it's a big one, I think, for people with hypermobility, because we all love stretching. And what I am doing today is I'm going to delve kind of deeply into what stretching does to our bodies, and then we can look at like the best ways for us to approach tension and things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a presentation, and some of it might be a little bit more complicated, and if you don't understand it, don't worry about it and ask me afterwards, and I'll try and clarify anything that is a little bit harder to understand. I'll try and make it understandable as we go. Anyway, I am going to share my screen and we're going to get started. Right, so tonight we are talking about to stretch or not to stretch. So in the context of tonight's talk, we're really talking about hypermobility and symptomatic hypermobility. I'm often asked the question of whether stretching is safe for somebody who has hypermobility. So hopefully tonight we can unpick what stretching does and ways that we can address stiffness and the feeling or the need to stretch in nice ways that you will understand and be able to sort of proceed safely and confidently. So many people with hypermobility express a strong urge to stretch. This is often due to many different various reasons, including the sensation of stiffness and a quest for relief from pain or irritability, or just not being comfortable. However, it is important to understand that stretching may not always be the most effective way to address the concerns or the issues that we have with our bodies. And in some cases, unfortunately, stretching can make our issues worse. So today we're going to explore the motivations behind stretching for hypermobility and uncover the complexities involved, because it's not as straightforward and simple as one might think. So first we need to understand stiffness. So stiffness can result from many different factors, and particularly in people who have hypermobility issues. And some of these factors can be inefficient blood circulation within the tissue, muscle tightening to support the hypermobile joint. So it may be really holding on to try and stabilize you. And while stretching might offer temporary relief from the stiffness, it may not address the root cause of the discomfort, so the discomfort just comes straight back. In some cases, stretching, unfortunately, can actually lead to increased joint laxity and instability. So we don't want this to happen, and we want to be able to address these issues without putting ourselves in a compromised position. So reasons why people who are hypermobile may like to stretch. have actually been documented. And some of these reasons are to feel normal. So we want to feel like we can stretch like everybody else. My daughter once said that to me. She said she loved stretching because she wanted to just be like all of her friends and be normal. So to reduce pain is another big reason. To improve range of motion, because although we may have hypermobility, we can also have areas of tension and tightness. So there may be areas that we would like to improve range of motion in. To feel good, just to, again, if you've got the blood circulating and stretching has an effect on the system, it does feel good. Sometimes it doesn't feel good, and sometimes it feels great. So people will stretch to feel good. And sometimes it's just an enjoyable sensation, stretching. And that may partly be because when we stretch, we find that end of range and we actually get some feedback also into our bodies. So, what is hypermobility? So, I think first, in order to talk about hypermobility, we need to understand actually what mobility is. So, we'll break it down a little bit. So, mobility in the human body is defined as the ability to move freely and easily. And this is complex. It's a complex phenomena that involves the coordinated interaction of different systems. And research has actually identified that there's a number of factors that contribute to mobility in the human body. And these different systems include muscles, bones, and fascia. So the muscles and bones in the body work together to create movement. The muscles provide the force to move the bones, while the bones provide a lever system for the muscles to act against. The fascia is another structure that contains connective tissue, and it permeates all of the organs, the muscles, the bones, nerve fibers to help support all of it. So it holds all of it together. And it plays a huge role in perception of our posture. So all of these things working together are part of what create mobility. The joints in the body allow for the actual movement. So the actual shape of the joints will dictate the motion that we can make within a joint. And then we have the nervous system, which controls the movements by controlling the muscles and how they work. The brain sends the signals to the muscles telling them to contract or relax. And they're in charge of telling which muscles to contract and relax at which time. So it's called motor patterning, and they send the messages for each movement we make, what muscles to use. And sometimes they aren't optimal. So there is a coordination of all of these things to provide good mobility. And when one of these things is not working together quite well, then our mobility might be altered. The sensory system provides feedback to the brain about the position and the movement of the body. So we have all of our senses, and our senses might be altered with hypermobility. So we may struggle with actual mobility in terms of coordination of everything together to feel like we can move freely and easily, but we may be hypermobile at the same time. So in summary, mobility is the ability to move freely and involves the coordinated effort of muscles, bones, joints, and the nervous system and the fascia. In the context of hypermobility, individuals may experience an excessive range of motion, leading to stiffness and pain, which we may try to address through stretching. So it seems counterintuitive, but that extra mobility might actually be partly what leads to our stiffness and our pain. So hypermobility is a condition that's characterized by excessive joint mobility and is often referred to as joint hypermobility. So it can be associated with things like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or hypermobile spectrum disorder, and it can occur independently or it can occur systematically. So we can have a generalized joint hypermobility. People with hypermobility will always have joints that move beyond a normal range. So you can have a hypermobile joint, but also feel stiff. So we can have one joint that's super mobile and another one that isn't as mobile. So we can still have the feeling of stiffness while being hypermobile. So excessive range in one joint might actually create stiffness in an adjacent joint. And the spine is a good place to think about this in context. So you may have one joint that has a large range of movement. And when you, let's just use the example of rotation, we go to rotate, we always rotate through that joint that has a lot of movement. And so because we can make the movement through that one joint, the other joints don't necessarily need to join in. So we may have joints above or below that don't move much. And so we can kind of spin around one joint without getting into the others. And that can create a feeling of stiffness and tension. So that stiffness can also come from other factors other than joints, such as muscles, nerves, and fascia. So I wanted to look at a little bit of what actually happens when we stretch. So it's complicated and coordinated with different systems in the body. And I'm going to try and make this as simple as I can, because it's, as a process, it might not be that simple to understand. Because stretching isn't a case of just stretch it and then it contracts. It's not like a straight line. So we have this image. And so when we're looking at biological, so human or living things, it's different to non-living things. So non-biological materials, like if we took an elastic band, you could just stretch it and it would just return to its normal length, and that would be it. But in living tissues, it's a bit more complex because we have what we call viscoelastic properties. So elasticity in living tissue doesn't follow that simple linear pattern, and it's influenced by force and timing. So stretching involves a dynamic interplay of forces and time that will affect our tissues. So I've tried to simplify this as much as I can. And I'm not going into it in real detail. I'm just trying to explain the basics of it. So if you imagine a muscle, at the end of your muscles, you have tendons, and those tendons attach to your bones. And those tendons are made up of collagen fibers. So you have lots of little collagen fibers that will make up your tendon. And each of those collagen fibers, like if you look at the image, is a little bit like a spring. So they would say it's crimped. And this makes it a bit stretchy. And it works a bit like a spring. So when you start to stretch the tendon, it starts to uncoil or uncrimp. So that, as you can see in that image, that spring starts to get a bit wider. When you get that uncrimping, it actually starts to make it a little bit stiffer and a little bit less stretchy. So this happens more at the end of a muscle stretch. So you would get to the end of that muscle stretch and then you'll feel that sort of resistance. And this is the uncrimping. And it's essential for generating force when you need it, like when you jump. People with hypermobility, unfortunate, these collagen fibers and the springs that they create, those tendons, can uncoil too easily. So they reduce muscle force. So activities like jumping can be harder, and running, which I'm sure that if you are somebody with hypermobility, you'll understand. And it takes us more effort then. It takes the muscle more effort to actually make the movement. So we have elasticity, which is why our line is not just a straight line. We have the elasticity and the viscosity. So looking at elasticity, it's the ability of a material to change shape under load and to return to its original shape when the load is removed. So if you do think of the rubber band, when you stretch, it elongates, and when you release it, it returns to its original shape. And generally speaking, when we stretch a muscle, that is precisely what it should do. It should be taken to its length the body gets signals when it gets to a certain length to then contract it back. So hypermobility impacts this, and the tissues have more elasticity. So it means that we can stretch more excessively and we can change the shape of it more extensively, and it will be subjected to the forces. So it will take less force for us to change that shape. And it can make us, unfortunately, prone to overstretching and instability. So less force takes us into a greater stretch. So the other half of this is viscosity. And in the context of living tissues, it refers to how quickly a substance or a tissue will change its shape when it's subjected to force. So in muscle tissue, viscosity can be related to how quickly that tissue adapts to the changes in the force or the length. So in hypermobility, the viscosity might be different. So for instance, the tissue could adapt more slowly to the changes in force, making our movements less controlled. So towards the end of the range of a movement, you'll have a certain amount, or you should have a certain amount of stored force from the elasticity of that spring. And this is partly because of the properties of the tissue, but also from something that we call your reflexes. So people with hypermobility will have stretchier tissue with a different type of viscoelastic property than somebody without hypermobility. So the buildup of force from the tissue will be less, and sometimes reflexes might not even be present. So what we were just talking about was something called Hooke's law. And Hooke's law, which is looking at viscoelastic properties, does not account for the more neurological part of function. So motor unit function includes something called the stretch shortening cycle. And this is more of a neurological function. And that means when you stretch a group of muscles, you get to a certain point in the stretch, and your body will want to contract that muscle again. And that helps us in how we move and function on a daily basis. So towards the end of the range, we have a certain amount of stored force from the elasticity of that crimped tendon. But we also have some amount of force that comes from our reflexes. So people with hypermobility will have stretchier tissue, and they'll have a different type of viscoelastic property. The buildup of force from the tissues will be less, and the free reflexes might not even be present. So this has implications for us when we're thinking about stretching and how we might want to stretch. So it's a well-known fact that people with hypermobility have reduced proprioception. And this is mentioned in pretty much all of the literature. And there is also an indication in some studies that can be an alteration in reflexes. So this won't be for everybody, but some people will have an alteration in reflexes. And it may not mean that those altered reflexes are in all parts of the body. It might just be in certain parts as well. So they did do a study on adolescents and adults with HSD and HEDS, and they looked at the knee flexor reflex, and it was absent in 47% compared to a group of people who weren't hypermobile. And in the people who were not hypermobile, the reflex was present in absolutely all subjects. So this is a really big, a big thing for us to think about, because that stretch reflex is there partly to protect us. So it's a response that our body has when a muscle gets stretched. And it's meant to stop you really from overstretching. So if you were to pull your finger back, your body, when you get to a certain point, would react and stop it from being pulled too far. So the reason this happens is we've got little sensors both on the ends of the muscles or near the tendons, and also in the middle of the muscles. And I'm not going to go into this in depth, but when things get stretched, you have this loop. You can just see that image there. And that loop goes into the spinal cord and it loops back pretty quickly. So this is a protective loop. And it would also stop you from burning your finger. If you put your finger near a hot flame, you would get that immediate response to pull your finger back. And this is also a reflex action. It's not the stretch reflex, but it's also a reflex action. So we have these protective reflexes in our body to stop us from doing things that will create harm. So when we think about nerves again, we think about the nervous system, and we have what we call the peripheral nervous system, which is all of the nerves outside of the spinal cord and the brain. And then we have the central nervous system, which is our brain and our spinal cord. And that is the control center that processes the information from the centers that helps our bodies decide what to do. So the nerves on the nerve ending, so in your tissues, your muscles, your tendons, your fascia, those nerves will go to the spinal cord, and you'll either get a quick reflex or the message will be sent back up to the brain and come back down to give a message to tell the body what to do. So all of these nerves are held in what we call connective tissue, and it's a wrapping that holds everything together. So it helps to keep our sensors and our wires in place. And so with people with hypermobility, it might not be quite held in the same way, so we might not get the same sensory feedback. So when we go to stretch a muscle, the Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles tell your brain what's happening through the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, so the ones that are outside the spinal cord and the brain. And then your brain reacts and tells our bodies how to react appropriately, or sometimes in our cases, we don't get such appropriate reactions from the body because of the way our connective tissue is. So that has implications when we start to think about stretching. So hypermobility and the stretch reflex, people who have hypermobility do not have a stretch reflex, or might not have, some people do, because of how the proprioceptors and sensory organs in their muscles and tendons work, not because the tissues, not because of the viscosity or the elasticity have changed. So while these concepts are interconnected, the lack of the stretch reflex is primarily associated with proprioception and neural or nerve factors. And that's where, when we talk about it later, we can look at some things that maybe help with proprioception while we're doing stretching. So hypermobility and the stretch reflex, the lack of that stretch reflex in some hypermobile individuals can be attributed to impaired proprioception. The muscles and the tendons in hypermobile individuals may be more elastic, potentially leading to a delayed or weakened activation of muscle spindles and GTOs, which are the sensors. So those are the sensors on the inside and the outside of the muscles. And so because of this reduced proprioceptive feedback, individuals may not experience that typical stretch reflex response, which is protective when their muscles are stretched. And this can definitely have implications for joint stability and our bodies, because they might be not as good at protecting us against overstretching. So in order to get a reaction from these organs, they require stimulation of the tissue around the nerve ending. So if the connective tissue in those with hypermobility is more lax, we can hypothesize that we might need greater force in order to stimulate that reaction, that protective reaction. So we know that research has shown that we look for a balance in reactions around a joint. So to try and explain it a little bit better, if you have hypermobility and we look at sensations and feedback, that the brain needs some form of tension to give that to us. So this is not necessarily in relation to stretching, but in all aspects of our being, the body is looking for some form of tension for feedback neurologically in order to give a message. So the brain, if you think of the brain as being blindfolded, it's relying on the sensory nervous system. It's relying on messaging coming from our body up to the brain, and it can only guess what's going on unless it gets some really feedback from the sensory nervous system. So even when it comes to proprioception, I know they've done studies, and if you were to stand with hyperextended knees where you're locking into the back of the knees, that locking into the back of the knees actually gives you some proprioception, so you feel more stable there. Unfortunately, what we may lack is then that stretch reflex again. So we might be overstretching the tissues in the back of the knees because we haven't got enough tension going through it. So it doesn't send a message to sort of keep things in a good place. And we know if you unlock your knees and maybe you haven't got good muscle strength or control, then you feel like you have no proprioception. You don't really know where you are in space. You can't actually tell where you are or what you're doing. And so again, it's really important when we think about stretching, we have to think about, is our body going to a range which is safe, or is it not safe, and could we possibly be creating micro trauma when we take ourselves into those positions? So it's not always clear which structures or mechanisms can limit range of motion during stretching. So there are lots of things that could make us feel stiff. And when we go to stretch, there will be different parts of the body and different tissues and mechanisms at play to make us feel like we come to that end of range, or to potentially make us feel stiff. So nerves, with what we call nociceptive fibers, which are pain receptors, may limit range of motion. So we may have a lot of pain receptors that get highlighted when we start to move our limb, and this can make us limit our range of motion. We can have nerve tension, and this can affect our joint range. So if your nerves get irritated or inflamed, if you've got inflammation around it, that can limit your range of motion, because nerves don't stretch at the same rate as musculature. If the nerves are irritated, it will limit that range of motion and make you feel stiff. You've got fascia, so your fascia and connective tissue can also limit motion. So it's very sensitive to strain and pain, but it also will be affected by any kind of injury and scarring and scar tissue. So that tissue may not move normally anymore, and that might make us feel restricted. So we have a possibility of nerves, fascia, influencing our range of motion during stretching. Fascia can connect distant joints, supporting. So if we think about connecting to distant joints, you could have a restriction in your fascia for many different reasons. And it might affect your mobility elsewhere up the chain, because it's all connected as well. So sometimes our feeling of tension maybe doesn't come from where we're feeling the tension. So if you imagine you take your hand on your shirt, the bottom of your shirt, and you pull the shirt downwards, you can see on my sweater, if you can look at the little image, when I pull the bottom of my shirt, the tension actually pulls all the way to the top. So it may be that I feel the tension there. So I might feel like I want to stretch out there, but actually the tension comes from the pull down below. So if I'm not aware of where that restriction is come fascially or where the pulling is coming from, I could be overstretching the wrong bit and destabilizing that, where actually if I did a little bit of release from the bottom, that would relieve the tension up the top. So that's also something really important to keep in mind, is that sometimes that tension you have won't be coming from where you think it is. So when we think about that connectiveness, again, we can look at some of the studies that have been done that prove this really. So there was one study that was done on unilateral stretching, which is one limb. So they stretched one leg, and then it was shown that it increased the range of movement in the other limb or the other leg, which means when we stretch one part of the body, it can affect the nervous system and create a change in tension elsewhere in the body. So our nerves, our nervous system, our central and peripheral nervous system all come from the top. So they all come from our brain, and we've got the spinal cord, and the nerves all come out from there. So it's all interconnected. So if you pull one bit, it will always be affecting another bit. So there's endless examples of this. So another paper looked at stretching of the lower limbs, and that increased the range of movement in the upper limbs. So stretching the legs increased the range of movement in the shoulders or the arms. Another one showed stretching of the hamstring muscles or the lower legs. So plantar flexors are the things that point your feet. And this induced an increase in the maximal range of motion of the cervical spine of the neck. So this is something for us to really take into account as people with hypermobile issues, is that we might feel tight in those hamstrings for maybe irritated nervous system. That might come from something like cranial cervical instability. And then actually when we stretch those hamstrings, we make our neck less stable. So it's super important for us to keep in mind that if we do have real areas of instability, that stretching other bits of the body might result in making those tissues even less stable. So there's big implications to that. So we will talk about types of stretching, because most of this will be in discussing static stretching, which will have more impact. But all of it will induce changes in the whole body. So we have to keep this in mind. So this would suggest that stretching can induce increase in the overall stretch tolerance. So the body's sensory perception, again, the tolerance that you feel when you stretch. And it will make you feel like you have not got a limit to where that joint can go. So when we stretch for a long time, it's changing our perception of our ability. And unfortunately, again, with some issues with people with HEDS and HSD, it could lead to subluxations and dislocations. So there are different types of stretching. And so it's really important for us, when we do feel the need to stretch, that we look at how we stretch, because there are some types of stretching that will be much safer than other types of stretching for us. And that will be based on our viscoelastic properties, on our reflexes. So things like ballistic stretching, which are fast and repetitive, will be more risky for people with hypermobility issues. And so not recommended doing these bouncy movements into end of range. And hopefully not many of us are doing that anyway. And then we have static stretching, which is a really popular way to stretch. And most people, certainly when I was younger, I was told that I had to hold a stretch for 60 seconds or more for it to work. And yes, there is evidence that it will improve range of motion, both short-term and long-term, but there's also a lot of evidence that say that it can have a negative impact on strength and power, and it could be associated with risk of injury. And I know from looking at studies, it's particularly in what we call the eccentric phase of muscle use. So when we bend our elbow, we're contracting the muscle here. And then when we let it go, it's that letting go, the muscle becomes really weak then, and you are more at risk of damage. And a lot of injuries happen at that time. So static stretching is not really recommended for people with hypermobility, because we do not need to make ourselves weaker. So dynamic stretching, this is a slow motion in and out of range, which is a more like what we would call a nerve glide, which I will, on my next talk that I give to SEDS members, will be showing you how to do. So nerve glides are a type of a very specific type and way of moving. So it's slow and it's in and out of range, and it never stops. So you're not holding a stretch. Now there's more specific things to nerve glides, which we will go into on a different talk. So this is really different to that ballistic type of stretching. You're not bouncing rapidly at the end of a range of movement. You're going in and out. So we've got the time for our bodies to register what's going on. We can take it in and out of range with control. And this has been shown not to create weakness. So you can still take it to that range where it feels good, and you feel like you might be improving your blood flow or just easing things a little bit, because it's movement, and movement has been shown to make us feel good as long as we're keeping those joints centrated. So that's very important when we're doing our dynamic stretching, is the centration of the joints. But you can take it into that feeling of a bit of stretch and be safe. So that's great for us to know. So there is a last type of stretching, and it's called proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, and that's PNF, and then METs, which are muscle energy release techniques, and they work under the same principle. The big difference is that PNF, or proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, uses much more force than muscle energy release techniques. So both of these techniques will ask you to contract the muscle while it's being lengthened. METs are a little bit different in how we proceed. There's different types. But both of these techniques, because you are contracting the muscle, you're giving messaging to those Golgi tendon organs, to those muscle spindles. You're creating tension for the brain to know where it is to keep you safe. So these are considered safer ways to stretch, and they have shown through research that you do not lose strength or power when you use these versions of stretching. Now, I personally think with hypermobility, there won't be have been enough research done on people who are or do have hypermobile joints, that the PNF, which is a much stronger contraction, I think would be less safe for us than the muscle energy release techniques, which is the technique that I use almost exclusively if I want to release tension in my hypermobile clients, along with nerve glides. So METs, or muscle energy release techniques, are an alternative to stretching. They are technique that uses the muscle's own energy to relax it. So we don't know 100% how it works, whether it's on a neurological level or whether it's on a cellular level, but it's not a passive way to stretch. So we are keeping things safe. There's a couple variations: reciprocal inhibition, post-isometric relaxation, and actually there's a couple more that aren't mentioned here. But what I am going to do is, on my next talk for SEDS, it will be taking you through how to do muscle energy release techniques and also nerve glides. So that will be the next talk next month that I give. So a definition of a muscle energy technique is a system of therapy for the treatment of movement impairments that combines the precision of passive mobilization with effectiveness, safety, and specificity of re-education therapy. And where this becomes important is when we talked at the very beginning of this talk, we talked about the coordination needed between different systems for nice free mobility. So this helps to re-educate and coordinate those systems. The client's muscles are actively recruited on request from a precisely controlled position in a specific direction. So I will show you all of this in our next talk. And this does involve fascia, and it involves the nervous system, the muscles, it involves everything. And it was developed by an osteopath. So it really principally came as an osteopathic technique. So some of you may have already done these. I know that physiotherapists are taught this. As a sports therapist, I was taught muscle energy release techniques, which is where I first came across it, and thought, oh my goodness, this was amazing because it made an enormous difference to my body, and bits I'd been fighting for years trying to stretch and had no results in. All of a sudden I got changes when using this technique. And so the other thing that we think about is the nerves in stretches, because as I said before, the nerves do not stretch at the same rate as the muscle tissue. So we talk about viscoelasticity. It's got a different rate of stretching to the muscles, and they do not stretch as far as the other tissues. So if you do have irritation in the nervous system, or the nerves can be caught up in that fascia, then they will not be happy if you take them into a big stretch. And what can actually happen is when you stretch, it feels good because you're getting into the tension, but then a few hours later, it will tighten you up and make you even more irritated. So just looking at the nerves again and thinking about how and when we stretch and the impact, because we say the whole body is connected. Flexion, so bending forward, creates nerve tension in the body, and extension, so arching backward, takes tension away. So if you have a really wound up nervous system, extension might feel better than flexion. And then things like shoulders being dragged down. So if you've got really unstable shoulders, those will be pulling on the nerves going up to the brain. That will actually affect the nerves in the entire body, because it will create tension at the top. It will create tension all the way through the body. So how things sit and how stable we are can really affect that tension in the nervous system, which might be causing issues with us. So again, another take on ways to address tension might be looking at how the nerves might be pulled by different bits of instability in our bodies. So this is where we have things like compression garments, again, that can come in to help with the somatosensory system. That's all our senses. So that's those nerve endings, those proprioceptive nerve endings, those muscles, those Golgi tendons, those muscle spindles. All of that compression can give feedback to these systems to help the nervous system to know what's going on in the body. Then it can also help with the vascular system and return of blood flow to the heart and the brain. So it can be affecting us in that kind of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So take us out of that fight or flight, needing to run from the tiger, which will create a feeling of tension, into more of a sense of relaxation. So that's where your compression garments and your weighted blankets can really help as well. So that is the end of my presentation tonight. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope you've found it useful, and I have time for questions if anybody would like to ask them now. So we've got in the chat. Oh, we've got lots of stuff in the chat. So I'm going to look at these questions in the chat, and then if anybody wants to add some more, that's fine. Stiff mid-thoracic from degeneration disc disease, can hardly twist. If I do, I twinge and sharp pain and spasm. My physio wants to work on that, but I feel reluctant. Okay? So what we have here is we like what we've talked about in our presentation, we've got different things at play here. So you'll have, if you've got less space between your discs, you've got bones coming closer together, and you may have got irritation in the nervous system as well. So what I would say, this is really common for people with hypermobility issues, and I think there's a lot of, we do suffer with a lot of nerve tension. I would agree with you about being reluctant to get somebody working hands-on too much into that system. I think what you would be best doing is, interestingly, potentially, I might stand up to show you things that might help with that. I think you could do some like lying on your back with a TheraBand around a foot, do some little bend and stretches with the leg, because we know that's going to be changing your tissues everywhere. And if you've got an area where the nervous system is uptight, I try to work away from that area. So I would do some little bend and stretches with the leg, and I might do some rotations very gently, lying down, or just look at the shoulder blades. So I would be thinking about looking at whether my shoulder blades could move towards my spine or not, and just getting freedom, like doing some pulling the shoulder blades together and pulling them apart. And I would kind of work that way and then just see how the spine feels, rather than trying to tackle the spine itself. So I know someone who enjoys weight machines, but she keeps dislocating her shoulders. She wants to just use a brace, but it doesn't seem right advice. Okay, so this is kind of coming out of the stretching realm, but my feeling about braces is that if somebody is really struggling, I'd rather put them in a brace. If she could do some exercise like weight machines with a brace on and tolerate it without dislocating, she'll still, the scary idea is that if you put a brace, things get weaker, but actually you can still do strengthening in braces. And actually you're better off not having that, like if the shoulder is hanging and stuff like that, and that's irritating the nervous system, and that will affect the muscle function. She is probably better off actually putting a brace on. Don't be afraid of braces. Try and work in them. So I was told to stretch, but nothing helped years ago by some physios. I had years and years of never-ending tightness and spasms. Yeah, because you probably weren't working on the right system. So like I do, if a physio just says to stretch, they don't understand hypermobility. That kind of worries me for all the reasons we talked about tonight. So you would have been much better off being given some METs or some nerve glides to help. And so that's from Jane. I hope you attend the talk next month, which will be actually showing you how to do some muscle energy release techniques, which will be more safe, more effective, and more safe. So, Joe, have you heard of @wealth on Instagram? No. If it doesn't feel right, then don't do it. That is, my clients, when they come to see me, are never wrong. So I'm, unfortunately, I don't know @wealth on Instagram, but I definitely would steer clear of it if it doesn't feel right. So thank you, Jane. So how are compression garments reducing tension? Could you please go through it again? Yeah, so this is the thing. When we don't have compression garment, a compression garment will give the brain proprioceptive feedback. So when we talked about our reflexes, and I talked about all the messaging that goes on between the systems, the compression garment, and we talked about like timing of things and elasticity and tension of things. When you are doing something with a compression garment, it's going to change the speed because you're having to work against a bit of tension there. So actually, your muscle is going to have to work a little bit more. It's going to create more feedback, more proprioception, which might give more signaling to the nervous system, like to tell you when the muscle is in stretch or when it's contracted. It just gives you that proprioceptive feedback to make the messaging to the brain work a little bit better. So that's going to in turn have us just work a little bit more normally. So what I would say is compression garments, they also help bring the blood flow, keep the blood flow going back up to the heart and the brain. So they'll stop us from maybe feeling in a state of fight or flight. So when our nervous system gets uptight, it tightens our muscles and it sends the blood to the muscles to prepare us to run from the tiger. So we'll feel tension. If we're in a state of fight or flight, then we're going to feel tension in our muscles. So the compression garments helps get blood back up. So it may help get it back up to the heart. It might help it get it back up to the brain, which then in turn helps our nervous system to feel more relaxed. It will allow us to go into a state of parasympathetic, which will make us feel less tight and taut. So I hope that answered your questions. Any other questions from the group? Thoughts about yoga? So this is my thing. I am a Pilates teacher and I have only taken 2 yoga classes in my whole life. Now I know there's lots of different types of yoga. I'm very aware of that. And I wouldn't want to say anything inappropriate in regards to yoga because I'm not an expert on it and I don't know enough to comment. I know that there's some very great things about yoga where it works on trying to relax the nervous system. In terms of, I believe it tries to stay active in its poses. I think you're not meant to hang out. I think you're meant to stay quite active. I think it probably sounds really hard. So you're at an end of range, but you maybe are quite active. But I would ask somebody who is an expert in yoga on that rather than myself. Anything else?
Hey Bonnie, I've got something.
Okay.
So I'm going against the grain. All this relaxing, lovely, but some people don't like relaxing, they want movement.
Yeah, so absolutely. So I think when I talk about relaxing, I'm not talking about relaxing like trying to take you from sympathetic to parasympathetic. I was just using that as an example of one thing that might cause tension. I think movement in itself is great. That's what, when I say dynamic stretching, it's basically movement. So it's moving in and out. It's keeping yourself moving. What it's saying is you can actually take that movement to the end of range and still be safe, which is great. So enjoy your movement. Does that make sense?
Thank you, because I like that.
Movement's our best friend. It's our best friend. It makes us feel good.
And maybe particularly cases when I've been immobile completely, and I'm sure a lot of other people are, what do you suggest they could do? Say they're bed bound or definitely sofa bound or something like that.
Well, I think you can do all kinds of movements. And I think what's really interesting is when I talked about, say, a little stretch on one end of the body. So if you did, say, foot pumps, or you took a band under your foot and you were in a chair or in a bed, that's still going to actually release tightness up the chain. It's still going to affect your whole body. So you don't have to be going to the gym. You don't have to do everything. Whatever you have available you can move is going to interact with the whole body. So it's just whatever you do move is great. Yeah.
And so that would, if you're working in an office or on a desk for a few hours, you could move your legs and pump them.
Absolutely. So if whatever bit of your body is really problematic and you don't want to move there, you can move elsewhere and still benefit that bit, which I think is huge, really.
Yeah.
So,
got another question. Shall I read it out, or do you want to?
Do you have any studies I can read about stretching and its effects on the brain? So I think when we're talking about the brain, we are talking about the nervous system again. And we are probably talking about sympathetic, parasympathetic. So I think, again, I can find some studies for you if you want. I didn't particularly for this presentation look for that, but I can definitely find you what there is. It's whether or not it relates to hypermobility, because there's very little research, unfortunately, on these things that relate to hypermobility. And you may not find that if there's a study on the general population, that it would have the same effect on our brains, because when we stretch, it's not having the same impact on the body as the average person. So when I'm looking at studies, I'm generally looking at stuff for hypermobiles, and there's much less available. Is that okay? Helpful?
I don't know, Bonnie, if you've introduced what you're actually doing this year.
So I probably haven't introduced myself to some of you anyway, so I'll just give you a bit of my background. So I was a ballerina. So I danced in America originally. You could probably tell from my accent. And then I married an Englishman, and I came to the UK, and I was a first soloist with the Royal Ballet for a time. And my career did end a bit early because of my condition, which I didn't know I had EDS at the time. So I've got hypermobile type EDS. I then went on to train as a Pilates teacher, and I'm somebody who is never satisfied with what I know. I'm always asking why. So I then became a sports therapist, and I took lots of courses. I'm a cranial sacral therapist, all of that. And then in this last year, I decided I wanted to do more research, because I have tons of questions relating to hypermobility. Not enough people doing research in the musculoskeletal sector. So I've gone on to do an MSc in dance science, where I'm full of people with hypermobility to do research on. So at the moment, I'm actually, I just got my research come back from ethics this week. So my research can start to take place like as of next week, and it will be on a bit of hypermobility. So yeah, finishing an MSc, which is really exciting. Am I neurodivergent? I think Jane would say I am. I would say I fall heavily high in the ADHD arena, let's put it that way. And I also have 3 children, and one of them is definitely higher on the autistic spectrum. So yes, I'm not formally diagnosed, but I like if I do talk to anybody who is an expert in that, I do fall highly on the ADHD spectrum. Yes, it is genetic, and definitely it's in my family and it's in my children. And yes, so I identify with everybody in SEDS, which is why I also love SEDS, because I think it's linking very important things together. And actually for myself, like everybody else, it makes a lot of sense. Like I have a scattered brain. Definitely.
We're having a lot of fun here. Some of the comments. You know, we can go on for a long time because it can just skyball. But I'm aware this is a webinar. And are there any last questions from anybody, or shall we? We're going to have Bonnie back, and we're even going to try and start on time. I think that's all part of it.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what happened there, but I promise we will get that sorted for the next time. So what I would like to say is So the next talk I'll give will be on these techniques I mentioned tonight, and that won't take too long. But if you have a subject matter you would like to know about or you'd like to understand further, then definitely put that in the SEDS Facebook page, or you can private message me through SEDSConnective Facebook, and then I will definitely try and make sure that I address it and talk about it for you all. So it was
That's
just
wonderful. Thank you so much, Bonnie. And I know those who haven't made it will appreciate this. And we will put it on our YouTube and our website once we can do that. And we will edit some of the parts out. So thank you again. Have a lovely weekend, everybody. And do follow our links for the next one. Thank you. Bye-bye.